Today I'm joined by a writer that I've enjoyed seeing on different news aggregators, his Substack. He's a historian by training, Chris Bray. How you doing, sir?
Great. How are you?
I'm doing well. So it's great having you on in the format that we have here on this podcast, where we can do a little bit more deep dive. Tell people a little bit about your background, and for those who are not familiar with your work, please.
My background, I'm ex everything. I'm an ex-journalist. I used to cover local news for small suburban newspapers. Was in the Army for 4 years. I'm an ex-soldier. I'm an ex-academic historian. I have a PhD from UCLA. Have no current identity. I've been a bunch of things and am none of those things anymore. I live in Los Angeles, have a wife and daughter.
And are you a filmmaker too?
I'm not. I'm not. Maybe I should be. Maybe that's my next mission in life. There are many, many people named Chris Bray, and it always confuses people. There's an Australian mountain climber. There's a British film columnist and biographer, and apparently a significant figure in the English Church of Satan. I'm not any of those people,
Wow.
nor am I a Canadian realtor. So if you Google Chris Bray, you will be very confused. Oh, there's a Catholic singer. Also not that guy.
Are you familiar with Eric Gahn's work? He's connected with UCLA, right?
I'm Eric who?
Eric Gahn's, the generative anthropology guy?
No.
Okay.
No, God, UCLA is so huge. I actually, when I was in the history department at UCLA, I was at an academic conference at the American Historical Association conference. And I'd been at grad school at UCLA for years and years and years. And I saw one of the history department professors in my field in US history. And I walked up to him and said hi. And he said, "Hey, we've met before. Are you University of Wisconsin?" So, nobody at UCLA knows anybody at UCLA. It's too big.
Yeah. Well, I have an interest in something that the reason why I was struck by your Substack, you were comparing religions and cults to what's going on in different events going on in our time. And that's something I was doing for some time. This podcast is called Things Hidden. It's a reference to the seminal work by the historian Rene Girard, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, which basically, in my opinion, provides a roadmap for understanding why ideology has the kind of religious structures that we're now kind of catching up to. We seem to only see the religiosity in politics when politics breaks down. You know what I mean? We can only see it when it's fraying apart, like Nazism or communism or the totalitarian ideologies and the millions killed in the 20th century. But when politics is working as a pacifier, as an opium, we don't see the religiosity of politics. We see it as something beyond religion, as something evolved far, far away from the primitive nature of religion. But I think now with wokeism and COVIDism and all these other isms, we're starting to realize that maybe, this is my hope, that politics has always been religious. You can't see it as well when it's working to pacify us,
Yeah. I think in the absence of religion, I think everybody has a religion. Some people just don't know it. And in the absence of a religion that's a religion, I think people look for some other thing to give them a cosmology, to fill in the blanks for them and give them a sense of order. I am, of course, completely unable to think of this person's name because I'm actually talking to someone in an interview, but there's a great book by a historian of religion at UC Berkeley called The House of Government. That is just a doorstop of a book. It's just this extraordinary thing. And it's a group biography of the old Bolsheviks that starts when they're all in prison or in exile under the Tsar and goes through the period when Stalin was purging them and killing them. And and analyzes the old Bolsheviks as a religious movement, as a millenarian cult that expected that when we do a certain set of ritual things, when we do a certain set of performances, we'll create utopia and we'll reach the end of history and everything will change. And like other cults that have done that, when they did all the performances and then the change didn't happen and the utopia didn't come, they reacted like millenarian cults react and struggled to find their way forward when their religion had failed. I should Google this name because it's a really important book, The House of Government, Yuri Sleskin.
Okay.
By starting to Google, I forced the filing cabinet of my brain to produce it. But I think it's not a new experience for people to experience, to live their politics as religion. I think it's a thing that happens in periods of crisis and decline, in periods when people can't make sense of the world and don't have some anchor to use to do that.
Do you believe that we've passed the point of being able to anchor back towards a Christian or a traditional religious transcendence, like that we're in a permanently post-religious era?
Boy, I don't know. I don't believe in permanent anything.
Yeah.
I think that history moves in cycles. But we'll say it looks like we're in a deep down cycle and in a period where people I think the decline of religion is marching alongside the decline of family, and that's the one that to me is the big loss of an anchor. If you Google up historical charts on the trends in marriage and family, I think people are much less anchored to one another, much less anchored to the social structure of family than they were 50 years ago, and are groping for sort of other forms of family and connection and other things to give them belief. And not just turning to politics and just the wasteland of social media, the just garbage of being part of a Twitter mob as a place of finding meaning without church, without community, without family, without all of the stabilizing institutions of society.
You talk in one of your posts on your Substack, you talk about our country as a Grey Gardens nation, referencing the 1975 documentary Grey Gardens. For those who are not familiar with that film, can you give us the meaning of that analogy?
So Grey Gardens was about two members of the Bouvier family, a mother and her daughter, who lived in a very large, very beautiful mansion in the Hamptons, near the ocean, in a very expensive neighborhood. And then dad, the husband, left and went off with his new wife or girlfriend and left them in the mansion. And so they persisted in the mansion for many years in a very wealthy neighborhood, in a very expensive house that they couldn't maintain, that they couldn't keep up, that they didn't really try to keep up, that fell apart around them. And so this documentary filmmaker spent a long time sitting in this crumbling, filthy mansion overrun by wild animals, watching them sort of eat food out of cans and watching the roof came in and the windows rot out. And I talked about people being given something that they don't know how to maintain, that they don't know how to run and keep up, and living in it, but not living in it as the thing that they got, watching their mansion rot around them because they don't know how to keep up their mansion. And talked about people inheriting a culture that had health in it, that worked in a lot of ways, but not knowing how to keep it up and not knowing how to maintain institutions that we've inherited. I talk about recipe knowledge a lot. There's a historian named Thomas Haskell who used the phrase recipe knowledge in a famous debate with other historians. He was talking about when you interpret the actions of historical actors? Are you starting from an idea of how much recipe knowledge they had? So recipe knowledge, you want to achieve a particular outcome. You want this thing over here to happen. So you have to take this step, and this step, and that produces this outcome. Or from the other way, that if you do this and this and this, you know how it'll end.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we're living through right now is an incredible collapse of recipe knowledge, an incredible collapse of people knowing how, of people doing lots of stuff, but not seeing what kinds of outcomes it will produce. And so in that sense, we're living in that mansion, that Great Gardens universe, that we have something we inherited, but we don't know how to maintain it.
Why do you think we don't know how to maintain it?
Because it's not maintained. I mean, starting with outcomes, looking at the world, looking at the way things are working. Public health is falling apart. We've had like 2.5 years now of, here are the measures that will end the pandemic. Here are the measures that will keep people happy. We've been doing them. We've vaccinated the hell out of everyone. We've all, worn masks for more than 2 years, and infections just keep going and going and going. The military is falling apart. People are, like the Army has agreed to reduce the size of the active force because they just can't keep it up. Violence, we had brought serious violence in major cities more or less under control, and it's coming back. We're losing control of cities. So I think, well, control is maybe the wrong way we're losing peace and order in communities. So I think we can't maintain it because I see things not being maintained. I see institutions that aren't working and aren't doing what they say they do, like Anthony Fauci, who is now experiencing a COVID rebound after telling us for 2.5 years how to keep ourselves healthy, and he's not healthy. So you look at the world, you look at the way things are working. You look at Janet Yellen or Paul Krugman spending all of 2021 saying, inflation, that's ridiculous. What are you talking about? And the people who are the experts, the people who are telling us what's going to happen or how the world is going to work. My favorite news headline that you see all the time now is, experts surprised by inflation, experts surprised by consumer sentiment, experts surprised by new wave of COVID. The experts are surprised a lot. And I think that's where I start. When you look at the people who tell you that they know how to run things and they keep telling you that they're surprised by outcomes, that says to me that they don't have the recipe knowledge that they think they have.
So what's the secret sauce that made our recipe so tasty relatively to what we're tasting now in all of our institutions?
Oh God, I don't know. I think
we used to have like people doing the Wright brothers stuff, and we still had everybody telling people they couldn't do it. I just think we've lost our confidence as a culture. We don't have confidence. We don't have charisma. We're very nervous and anxious, and we're very disparaging of ourselves as a people. That's the only way you can gain social status, is to pretend to be poor. The rich put on coats to look wealthy, and the poor put on overalls to look poor. We can't.
I wrote a piece on Substack once about CEO style, and Jack Dorsey, over the years, as he got richer and richer,
look poor and poor.
When he started Twitter, he used to have short hair and dress in like a button-down shirt. Yeah. It's really funny to watch the progression. But
I used to do a little thing at a farmer's market years ago, and my friend and I both had little stands. We were trying to do a little upstart thing in our 20s, and we'd always laugh at ourselves because we'd see this little trendy little hipster thing that we knew they had nice money, but they would come on with overalls, and they would pretend to look poor. And we were coming in with coats to a farmer's market because we were from simple means, and we are trying to show, hey, look, we're professional, here to sell you a product. And it was just interesting to see how different classes present themselves. Like people who are in a little wealthier status or whatever are going to be trying to hide that, to gain power or whatever.
As a refugee from academia, one of the things you see among undergraduates at Swarthmore, Oberlin, do you remember, I think her name was Geraldine Luther at Yale. All of these kids who come from very wealthy backgrounds, who are very privileged, who are very expensive schools, spend their 4 years competing in the Oppression Olympics. And Geraldine Luther, there was a professor at Yale who wrote a response to, there were 13 administrators at Yale who signed their names on a memo about Halloween costumes and said, be very careful this year that your Halloween costume doesn't oppress anyone. And there's a professor at Yale who wrote a memo that said, like, if you're a grown up, maybe you could make your own choices. Maybe you could choose your own Halloween costumes. And Yale went crazy that, she had done such a vicious thing. And her husband went out to talk to a group of students and say, look, my wife was arguing for your autonomy. She was arguing that you can think and choose, and you don't need paternalism, and you don't need protecting people. And Geraldine Luther, who's from a well-to-do family in Connecticut, screamed at him, "Be quiet!" and went on a harangue at him about how, your job as a professor here and as a residential master, his role was leading a residential college within Yale and being like a mentor to students. She said, you keep talking about this as an intellectual space and saying that you're trying to defend intellectual space. It is not an intellectual space. It is not. And she said, your job here is to make us feel safe. And you haven't done that. Resign. And I saw that personally. I think anyone who works in a very expensive college, very elite college or university now watches very, very privileged children fighting to score oppression points. And it's baffling behavior.
And of course, feeling safe would be a tell for religion, right? I mean, religion gives you identity. It lets you know who's good and who's bad. It lets you know what diet to eat. It lets you know how to dress, how to mark your time.
Right. Gives you a community.
Gives you your sanity. It gives you, your sense of togetherness. It helps you get along with your rivals when you can say, hey, you know what? I don't like you, and I don't like this, and I don't like that. But hey, we're not those guys that are not part of our team. So if all that's being destroyed when you go into a temple to be catechized in religion, and the dogmas are not being adhered to, it's a very unsettling experience.
And so you replace it with new dogmas. We talked a little bit on the radio the last time we talked about Christopher Lasch, and Christopher Lasch writing about the development of a new American elite growing out of the progressive era forward, who define themselves against, who define themselves by what they're not, who define themselves by what they disdain and by their distaste for middle America. And I think that development of, Christopher Lasch says the intellectual is a social type, the development of that identity. I'm not some dirtbag from flyover country. I'm not some Trump person. I have an education. That development of that identity has given people a dogma and has given people a set of ritual performances that define them so completely now that they can't escape it. It has become, that identity has become the replacement religion.
Yeah, remember the Summer of Love protests and riots where they had them all kneeling, thousands of privileged rich kids kneeling in the streets, and laying in the street screaming, "I can't breathe," in unison, chanting it. I mean, they were trying to partake of the collective experience of martyrdom together, like, hey, people being baptized where George Floyd died on the spot, where the very spot where they said, this is where he died. And they were being baptized, literally baptized in a little kiddie pool or something. So everything goes back to religion here. I mean, this is all, it's not an analogy. That's what I've tried to explain, because for years people, like in libertarian circles and stuff, say the states are like a religion, but it's not like a religion. It is these cultures, these ideologies and politics are not, they are vestiges of how we have come to define ourselves for thousands of years. And you can't, just because you've come up with a clever theory that says God is dead or whatever, well, listen to the rest of that quote. It explains why he's dead, right? And it explains what happened. It has to do with the revelation of the murder hidden since the foundation of the world that Rene Girard talks about, this idea that human societies function on a shared binding agent that is a scapegoat, right? And so when you start to screw up who is the designated scapegoat class, and you start to make it completely aware to you that you are scapegoating people, it's a very frazzling experience for people's mental health. It's going to destroy your mental health because you don't know who the villain is. And an example of that is like the Gerasenes that Jesus encounters, the demoniac, right? And he comes into this community that's considered to be a model citizen example of what the best of Roman society can offer the Galileans. If they would just start to learn to emulate them, they put a little Epcot. You know how Walt Disney wanted to create Epcot as his model city for tomorrow? The city of the Gerasenes in the northern region of Galilee functioned as kind of like an Epcot for the Jews to say, hey, look, the Romans really want us to get on board with how they model their towns and the worldview that they have. And this is an example of it. So Jesus arrives on that shore of the Gerasenes, and he's confronted by a possessed man named Legion, right? Which is the name of the military unit of the Roman Empire. And he casts the spirit of the crowd out of him and heals him. And when he does that, the text says that the town was terrified. They were terrified that the man was in his right mind, right? And that's kind of what happens in our culture today when we're supposed to define ourselves by being against middle America, against Christianity, against family, against meritocracy. When you see that not being so evil, it screws up your heart. It disturbs you because you feel terrified that the person that was supposed to be your collective punching bag is not really the vessel of evil that you've been told he was or she was, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, and watching the response to the Supreme Court's decision overturning Roe v. Wade, watching people go like they're going on pilgrimage to the homes of Supreme Court justices, looking to punish them, going in their handmade costumes. And, there have been people posting on Twitter about, Clarence Thomas should die. Trying to take all of your perception that something has been disordered and something has been lost and put it into a handful of bodies that can be punished and ruined, or a handful of people who can be ostracized or cast out. We can march them out of our country, and then the rift will be healed. There's a desperation to it, and a struggle to reduce a bigger argument in the culture to a handful of people who can be punished for it. I thought, the January 6th hearing with someone who was like an aide to an aide, saying that she heard that someone said that Donald Trump tried to grab the steering wheel of his limousine, and he tried to put his hand around the throat of a Secret Service agent to make them take him to the Capitol so he could join the and the Secret Service said, like, well, none of that really happened, but the desperation to find single figures who you can put all the sin onto, who you can put all the disorder onto is becoming really fascinating. I find the borrowing interesting.
Borrowing what?
One of the responses to the Supreme Court decision was the declaration that there would be a night of rage, which is what the SDS did. It's what it's borrowing the Weatherman / SDS Days of Rage in Chicago.
Yeah.
It's trying to
some boomer came up with that idea for the little kids to act out, you know. I'm sorry.
Trying to use the ritual structure of an existing politics that's supposed to give you meaning, instead of, and I like watching.
It's always these direct to video sequels of the original thing, you know, like even that, you know, like you just described that. It's always like these rip off, cheap. It's not the original actors. The budget's a lot weaker. The graphics are a lot worse. Everything they do is just a derivative of derivative of derivative. They can never do anything really that you know, interesting or different, whether it's good or bad.
The Supreme Court said, look,
what's that?
The Supreme Court said, this is not something that unelected judges should be deciding about. We're returning this conversation to the political sphere. You should be arguing about this. Your elected representatives should be voting on this political question. And if you watch like man in the street videos from protests, people were saying, a group of unelected judges have no business telling us what to do with our bodies, which is what the court just said, right? So it's like people aren't listening. They're not responding to what's happening. They're repeating the ritual phrases that are lying on the ground, waiting for that movement with that position to pick up and recite. It's recitation. It's not argument. It's showing up to chant a set of rituals.
So when you see that these rituals, people gathering together, doing these things, and they're not creating catharsis, they're not creating a pacification. Again, it's not pacifying the passions that it's supposed to pacify. You know, it's not, they're raging. They've impeached Trump twice. They're doing this January 6th thing. By the way, that I just realized that's what they hired the ex-ABC TV producer. Did you hear about that? That's why they hired him, to have those visuals like Trump grabs the wheel of the limousine. What a great that's a TV exec storyline, man. I mean, it's like, how do we visually implant into these low info folks that are the moderate middle or whatever that we want to sway in the midterms? We need to have these graphic visuals. That's what the left is very good at doing. The establishment loves playing with people's minds, you know, and getting those visuals cemented. So they're like, have a scene where the guy literally reaches over and grabs the steering wheel of the president's motor. You know, what a metaphor for this orangutan guy going off the handle. They said he was throwing ketchup on the wall. So he's like eating French fries. He's smearing his hands on the leather seats that, you know, were there for, decorous days like Obama and so forth. And he's smearing his hands with the salt and the MSG fry sauce, and he's grabbing the steering wheel and he's screaming. And, you know, I mean, what a great ABC TV exec visual you guys did there. I see why you hired the dude, but it's still cheesy. I mean, the guy probably was working on Happy Days or something. He's probably been at it for a long time and didn't realize those melodramas don't work as well in the digital age.
It's a lifetime. It's a lifetime movie.
Yeah.
The country's abusive boyfriend throwing ketchup at the wall.
Squishy.
If you don't want to be with me.
Yeah. But that's what he represents is he represents how could someone who flagrantly goes against all of these sacred ideals of our civic religion, how could that person be allowed in the holy halls of the White House? I mean, that's why it's such a horrible thing for these people. They're told that a guy who, talks about, women in crass ways and and talks about warfare as if, hey, we're going to go take the oil. I mean, he says the implied thing out loud, right? So he doesn't do statecraft in a gentle way, right? You're allowed to do like Biden and Obama and bomb the ever loving hell out of everybody, but you don't say you're going to do it because you're going to take the oil, or you know what I mean? You don't talk about it in a crass way. You talk about it as, we're spreading democracy, we're helping the children, we're fighting off little Hitlers all around the world. You're supposed to stay on the script. And Trump doesn't stay on the unified script, the narrative, the mythology of post World War II America, right? He doesn't stay on that script.
Appreciated about Donald Trump is that he talked, I mean, I actually was fascinated. I live in Los Angeles, so I'm, in as deep blue a bubble as you can live in, was the number of people who talked to me about how inevitable it was that once Donald Trump was president, we would sink into World War III and he would unleash violence all over the world. And Donald Trump, when he ran for office, talked constantly about, he used the phrase stupid wars. He said, for decades now, we've been fighting stupid wars. We need to do less of that. And he appears to have meant it. We actually didn't go to war for 4 years. And now we're stuck in this crisis. In Ukraine, fighting an increasingly unhinged proxy war. One of my weird sick hobbies is going around taking pictures in Los Angeles of cars with bumper stickers against war, set in the middle of Biden-Harris bumper stickers.
Yeah.
And sending them to friends. Like, you're not putting all of this together, are you? There was a moment, I was listening to NPR because it was so fascinating when Trump ordered the drone strike on General Soleimani, the Iranian Quds Force commander. There was a moment where for like 4 days, NPR every morning opened with, solemn music and said, experts saying World War III has begun. How will Iran begin to strike back? Where will the first bombs explode? How quickly will the world be destabilized? And on the 5th day, when none of that had happened, I turned on the radio and realized that we'd made the transition because they said, dun, da, da, dun, bamba. NPR, all things considered. Well, Star Wars has been an important cultural artifact, but women are not well represented in Star Wars today. We'll look at gender in Star Wars. Like, their World War III script didn't play out, so they said, oh, let's try something else. We have a set of political actors who are assigned a particular meaning, whether or not that meaning has anything to do with what they do. And we talk about them in ways that have no connection to real world events based on the archetype they're supposed to represent. Like Joe Biden is very committed to peace. And you can't talk people out of that. You can't argue people out of that. You can't reason someone out of a position they haven't reasoned their way into.
Yeah.
And so we're stuck with people who are very post-war when a Republican is president.
Yeah, it's interesting how that is. And well, they weren't really opposed to war though during Trump, because remember how they had The View come on and talk about how shameful it was that Trump was going to leave those poor Kurds by themselves and stuff. They sounded like Dick Cheney. I mean, it was the Democrat. I mean, I call the party today of the Democrat Party is the party of Dick Cheney. It is the party of perpetual war and nation building and empire. And it's interesting that they don't. I've always wondered that why they can't. And I asked this to a lot of guests, why they can't see, like, okay, so you want us to do, like Syria, you want us to do Libya, and there's a lot of gruesome deaths of people of color in these conflicts that these liberal interventionists bring us into. And you could do all kinds of George Floyd t-shirts of those deaths or those beatings or these things that happen all over in Libya and Syria on behalf of these liberal interventionists, how come they can't see that? How come they can't, how come the leftist culture doesn't seem to be able to see the pain and the suffering of the victims of these far off conflicts that they prosecute? Why is that?
Do you remember Barack Obama saying, "It turns out I'm really good at killing people,"
Yeah.
and it did nothing to make him not be Saint Obama. I think the single thing that we can't seem to do, and this happened after 20 years in Afghanistan when we left, and a 20-year project just collapsed. And something that we spent thousands of lives and trillions of dollars in 20 years doing turned out to have meant maybe nothing or maybe less than nothing. We can't talk about the culture and the impact of our foreign interventions, and we never have a critical discussion about what we're doing overseas. I actually think that's one of the ways that that we link the political parties share a common value. I don't see significant opposition to, call it, foreign adventurism from either party in any significant. Although I think there are a few, like Rand Paul, a few Republicans and Thomas Massie that oppose it, but not many.
I think that not enough people have connected the ways in which those foreign adventures and the moral trauma that people who have to prosecute those wars endlessly have gone through, of seeing people die that don't need, I've talked to Marines that had to, guard the houses of child predators, in Afghanistan, and watch as one of those 13-year-old kids that they had to guard the perpetrator against blows up and kills his Marine friends. Now, what a moral conundrum is that? It's your friend that you've become friends with in the Marines. It's like your brother in arms, and he's dead by the hands of a kid who's been horribly abused by this terrible person that your friend and you are protecting on behalf of your country to promote free. I mean, can you imagine what that does to people? And we have no idea, and there's no resolution to the terror, because they come home and the right says, "Hey, you did everything right," and the left generally kind of says, "Yeah, kind of too." And then it's just, there's no resolution. There's no, Afghanistan goes right back to the Taliban. It's just total nihilism,
The Taliban controlled half of Afghanistan before we invaded.
Right. Yeah, we just helped them expand it to all of it.
We made them more powerful. So to me, like the recoding, the change in meaning of coming home and seeing that something you've seen people die for, something that you've risked your life for, something that you may have, people went to Afghanistan and Iraq 4 and 5 times, to come home and just see it all just implode and see the country move on. That there's a recoding in that, to me, that however much you may have been committed to it, however much you may have been willing to do it, to see the whole country just abandon it and see that it was never going to mean anything and was never going to accomplish goals that anyone understood or knew how to work toward. I go back to the idea of recipe knowledge. Like, so what were we doing there for 20 years? Was there a strategy? Was there a way that we thought that was going to end? And seeing things implode when you've spent so much for them, I think changes the meaning of those things for people in ways that are really painful, that they struggle to make sense of for the rest of their lives.
And I think that seeing all these constant traumatic wars with no real resolution and no real cathartic meaning from them, right? Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, even the Arab Spring, all these different traumas that we're always involved with, horrible mass suffering caused by our interventions, regime change, coups, insurrections. It's funny, Liz Cheney likes to talk about insurrections, but she's got plenty of foreign insurrections on her watch that she'll never get a hearing on television to figure out why exactly those bloody insurrections all over the world happened with her and Pelosi's approval. But all these things they come back home because it's this energy that's never resolved, right? And I think that's why we see horrible school shootings and mental illness and random punchings. It's kind of like this apocalyptic undoing of the American fabric because there's all this violence, all this
Yeah.
sacrifice with no resolution, with no meaning, with no, okay, we did this because we killed
Right.
all these people because
Yeah.
we spent all this treasure because we saw all those horrible videos, because we saw the torture, we saw this in Iraq. I remember the newspaper every day, another soldier killed, another soldier killed, another, all this trauma. This life is sacred and it's being so desensitized, and there's no because.
Right.
Well, we
Well,
did this because
what was
look,
the plan?
we liberated, World War II was our last because,
Yeah.
right? It was our last, well, this is why we did this moment, right? As a story.
So I actually just got a message from I have a very old friend who's way out to my left who always says, well, don't forget the reason we're fighting all these wars is for profit. And I actually said, so what was the plan to profit in Afghanistan? There are ways that we try to even make sense of wars that we assign meanings to them, that that we're fighting for the corporations, we're fighting for profit. Well, that I don't even think are true. If we were fighting wars for profit, it might actually be a reason to fight them, right? We're just fighting wars kind of nonsensically. My impression is that we were in Afghanistan for 20 years without the slightest idea why we were there or how it would end. And the strangeness of a military with more than 2 million people in uniform fighting for 20 years and not being able to defeat the Taliban when the Taliban never numbered more than tens of thousands of people. The Taliban was never hundreds of thousands of warriors. The Taliban had something like 50 to 60,000 warriors. And the most powerful, most expensive military in the history of the world with more than 2 million people in uniform couldn't defeat them after 20 years. So you talk to people about sort of their ideological priors and they say, you know why we were there, right? You know what that war was really about.
Yeah.
And I don't know that. I don't buy a lot of those explanations. I just think that we've developed a habit of going to war without really a sense of why we're doing it.
Yeah.
I think we've developed a set of reflexes that we don't really manage. And we constantly do things without knowing how they'll end or without knowing what we intend by them. It's the military equivalent of if everyone gets vaccinated, the pandemic will end, and then the pandemic doesn't end. We keep doing things.
Yeah.
We need to pass my Build Back Better plan and add another $4.5 trillion of printing press money to the economy so we can bring inflation under control. We just keep sort of lashing out at random without knowing what we intend.
And I do think that there is a lot of, corrupt profiteering going along to exploit those things, but it's not necessarily the
intent or the plan or the meaning.
But it certainly they make a killing in the process of the killing. But I think you're right. I interviewed Curtis Yarvin, who said it's like a rabid dog that's like killing random sheep and it doesn't know how to stop. It's what it does. Or like a wolf that just goes on to the next victim. It just keeps randomly killing sheep because that's its kind of memory and muscle memory.
125-ish years ago, there was a soldier named Frederick Funston who fought in the Philippines. The U.S. Fought against Spain, defeated Spain, then took the Philippines and fought against Filipino insurrectionists for years.
Yeah.
And Frederick Funston said in the Philippines that he felt like the military he was serving was a blind giant. It was the most powerful force. It was an astonishingly powerful force that could smash anything it set out to smash. But it didn't maybe know why it was smashing the thing that it was smashing and wasn't too sure what it was fighting against or for. And I think that I don't think that that dynamic of the blind giant smashing things for no clear reason has persisted. I think it's actually really worsened, and has become more incoherent. As I mean, I think the things we do in public life, the things we do in policy and politics, have become increasingly incoherent in the absence of a plan and recipe knowledge, and in the use of politics as ritual performance,
Right.
as an attempt to sort of situate ourselves in the world and find meaning without a totally coherent framework.
I see it as like a kind of like a super Christianity, you know, this idea of trying to outcompete Christianity as a messianic force for the world, that America and its elites feel this religious impulse to do. And I think the tell, or you can see it, are things like the Kabul, you know, like embassy having a George Floyd mural, you know, and it's like, why are you? It's like we're this revolutionary victim cult, like going back to some of your this worldwide global victim cult, where we need to paint the victims that we have here domestically and like share this solemn reminder of our own oppressive past with people far, far away who are like, wait a second, you're oppressing me now. You're doing to me what you're trying to tell me how we shouldn't do this stuff. And this is honoring George Floyd. I don't know this man, but this looks very similar to the way you treat me, but yet you're painting this while you treat me this way. I don't understand this. This is insane, you know?
As the project was collapsing, as we built a 300,000 soldier Afghan army that just fell apart instantly. The year we left, the Kabul embassy very proudly posted on Twitter that they had flown the rainbow flag. Glenn Greenwald talks about, he says, contemporary wokeness is Raytheon flying the rainbow flag.
Yeah.
And I think he's not wrong. Having a set of symbols that you deploy in ways that are not entirely coherent in the middle of projects that are extraordinarily violent, but also extraordinarily ineffective, that don't lead where you think they'll lead. But we have a George Floyd mural.
But, it reminds me again of this, the Marine that told me he was in Afghanistan. He said that we did not have the stomach as a culture to employ the level of violence that would signal to the local Afghanis why we were serious about our worldview being imparted on them. So this idea that trying to tell the local community in your nation building project, hey, we don't want you to be allowed to, have your daughters, go around and have adultery or whatever like that. That would be something that you'd have to use force, violent, vicious public force to communicate to the local community's values, just so why it's important for them to subsume those new values. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
We don't have the stomach to go through the level of force that he said they would need to hear to register why they need to adopt those values that are being pushed onto them.
For the people who want to go to war, but go to nice war, we don't know what war is, and we don't know what war means. We don't know what it means to go to war. So we went to war for 20 years, but tried to not really go to war. So we still killed lots of people. We still had lots of Americans die. But we just managed to not accomplish anything at all doing it. I think consistently we don't see the reality of what we choose to do.
Right. So how do you think people get their bearings in this moment that we're in? You said family is the key for you, right?
I think family is a key for everyone. I've been watching. I live in California and have been watching what the California legislature is doing. The California legislature is advancing a bill right now that would allow, in its original form, would have allowed 12-year-olds to consent to receiving COVID vaccines without parental knowledge or consent. And the author of the bill got just enough pushback that he said, what if I said it was 15? But in the course of debating that bill, a state senator named Richard Pan, who's a pediatrician, gave a speech remarks on the floor of the California State Senate in which he said, well, you have to remember that in California, we already allow 12-year-olds to make all of their own medical decisions. And he's a pediatrician and a state senator. He says, as a pediatrician, if a 12-year-old comes to my office with a pregnancy or sexual assault injuries, or has been beaten by a domestic partner, has a sexually transmitted disease, well, of course I just treat that 12-year-old and don't tell her parents about it. Why should they need to know? So this vaccine measure would just be an extension of the things we're already doing. So for me personally, and particularly as a parent, the only way back, the only way to connection, the only thing that makes sense is seeing that that's going on, seeing that in policy and in politics, people are trying to make family less and less important and trying to break relationships between parents and children and rejecting it and not being a part of it. I think the thing that starts to make sense of life is being connected to other people. And once you see and recognize that there's a world of policymakers who are acting on you to try to destroy your connections, you can resist and fight against it. In your own, as politics, but in your own life. I was just reading, we were talking about Christopher Lasch earlier. I was just reading Christopher Lasch again this morning. And I was looking at his discussion of Charlotte Perkins Gilman saying 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, saying, all of the things we've socialized work so well. She said famously, bread has gotten better since we stopped making it at home. Like a good factory loaf is a really good loaf of bread. So if we can make bread outside the house and do it better than people baking at home, why not do the same thing with childhood? Why not socialize family functions? Why not socialize child welfare? Why not socialize education? Why not move more and more functions out of the house and professionalize them? And that war is, I think, our destruction and the destruction of our meaning and our foundation.
Yeah.
So that's my answer. That's my first answer, and it's a very partial answer, and there's so much more that's broken that it doesn't fix. But start with that. Start with connections to other people.
And we have to have I think we have to have a transcendent story that tells us who we are and where we're going, and things like that. And I do believe that. I know it's out of fashion and it's so hard for me to even talk about it without people thinking I'm trying to push religion, but it's going to have to go back to Christianity, because I think that's where we got to go back to the future. I think that's where we got our sense of I've been reading a book about how Christianity basically constructed what we consider childhood, as a thing, we take so much of what we see, like the dignity of childhood and the idea of children having special protections and things like that. We take it for granted. Oh, we did that as humanists or as enlightenment. And it's like, no, we've borrowed these things from a long, long process of Christianity protecting the least of these in all of its forms. And everything we see, like the abortion debate, is Christianity. It's theological debates on both sides. Right, because Christianity elevates the woman at the beginning of Christ's appearance. These stories of his resurrection are from women, right? The elevation of the woman's testimony as something that you're gonna bank your entire claim of reality on a woman's testimony in an age in which they were not even considered to be credible for a court, and that's such a radical pro-woman moment in history. We have no understanding of how radical and disruptive that was. to the order in which this story comes in. Or it's the story of the child, the pro-choice argument versus the pro-life argument, that every child, every human is sacred, even when it's small and you can't see the person. Those are both Christian. Those are like Christian doctrinal disputes taking place, pro-choice and pro-life. Like you're arguing within Christian framework, even if you don't believe in a metaphysical God. You're still operating in the imagination that Jesus set out in history, right? Protecting the vulnerable, protecting the victim. Who is the victim? That's the question of our time. Who is the victim? Who is the righteous victim who can employ the sword in a righteous manner to sacrifice for vengeance, right? And that's the big story of our time. And I think the only answer to that question is found in, I think, in the story of Jesus. So, I mean, that's the thing, is how do you bring that back when we've been told that, you just can't entertain the idea of a God who's involved in the world. I mean, you can't, because again, how can you have a family?
Yeah.
If you don't act like Jordan Peterson would say, even if you don't believe in Christianity, but we act as if God is real and involved in our lives, right? When we're honorable and kind and merciful and gracious to one another, even when nobody sees it or nobody counts it to our social status publicly. Those are the moments that we act as if there's a personal force involved in our lives that's transcendent beyond, the rules and whims of humans, right?
You've talked about, the last time we talked, you talked about the hijacking of the instinct to protect the least of these. And since you've said that, I've started seeing that in the news every day. I think the attempt to hijack the instinct to protect, in something like Geraldine Luther shouting at her professors at Yale, you've made me unsafe.
Yeah.
This is not an intellectual space. Stop doing that to me.
Right.
Trying to take the instinct to protect people and turning it in directions that don't have to do with protection, and turning it toward people who don't merit protection and away from people who do, is a really interesting cultural moment. Do you know about the Age of Consent campaign?
Mm-mm.
So in 1880,
is that in California?
That was nationwide.
Okay.
In 1880, and the people who led the Age of Consent campaign were the same people who were suffragettes. They're the same people who were temperance activists. They were middle-class women middle-class activist women in the Gilded Age and Progressive era. In 1880, in every state in the country, except Delaware, the age of consent was 10 or 12. In Delaware, it was 8. And by 1920, the age of consent all over the country was either 16 or 18. So there was a 40-year period during which women fought to protect children and to desexualize childhood in law. And now I find, people like Richard Pan standing up on the floor of the California Senate and saying, well, of course, when 12-year-olds come to me with STDs and pregnancies and they've been beaten by their domestic partners, which, the idea that a 12-year-old can have a domestic partner, well, of course, I just treat them, they deserve treatment, and their parents don't need to know about that. It seems to me like we're marching back over victories that we've won, and we're destroying protections and progress that we made in the past. We created childhood, and now we're trying to undo childhood. We desexualized childhood, and now we're trying to resexualize it. I was just watching a video of a 7 or 8-year-old drag queen dancing for adults, stuffing dollar bills into his clothes. We seem to be trying to give back cultural battles that we won a long time ago, and we seem to be trying to destroy things that we protected a long time ago.
I think the reason why is because America was founded as a revolutionary state, and it has this revolutionary fire to always upend hierarchies and always look to the frontier of who needs to be liberated from some kind of oppressive status, right? And I think that has manifested in different ways. And I think that that always on the lookout for the next frontier of a boundary that needs to be smashed will inevitably end up re-victimizing other groups of people in the process, right? So it's like, so again, my running thesis is why we're in the state of chaos we're in, why it has the culty feeling, all these different things. It's all an attempt for human beings to create in our American culture a super Christianity to supplant as a rival to Christianity and to scratch the itch of justice that Christianity catechized our culture in, right? Our law, our storytelling, our desire to save the misfit. I mean, it has a kind of effect that is going to continue even when people stop believing in the metaphysical claims of Christianity as a religion. The aesthetic and ethic are going to haunt us. And so I think what Christianity does is it's always giving us an awareness of scapegoats and misfits, right? And so why are we taking 6-month babies to drag queens bars? Why? Well, because you always have to be on the lookout for the next frontier of a group of people who could be misfits or scapegoated or excluded, right? And so it's like, well, the kid was yesterday's misfit, right? We took care of him, but that's passé. And now we must go on the hunt for the new misfit who is not getting their fair share of normative appreciation. You know, this is the way things ought to be. So it's like, we've got to include this way of being and this type of person's identity as a normative standard for how we ought to be and how we should express ourselves.
So I agree with you. I mean, I think that we are trying to come up with a set of ritual that replaces a lost set of ritual, and with a set of with a foundation that replaces a lost foundation.
Right.
I don't see a good end to any of that.
Yeah. So how do you live in that loss of meaning, though? That's the thing. How do you have a family in a culture of no meaning?
I don't know. And is his name Yuval Harari?
Yeah, I've heard of him.
The historian who made these famous comments at the World Economic Forum recently, in which he talked about what are we going to do with all of these useless people whose lives are completely worthless, who have no meaning and no structure. And his proposal was video games, I think, video games and drugs. I mean, you can't live like that. You can't live without meaning and without foundation and without structure. So the answer is that you find a way back to it.
Yeah, and I think that's the battle that we see is between Malthusians and Christians. The Malthusians are people who they love humanity in a collective sense, and they're willing to crack a few million eggs in the process of cleaning up humanity for tomorrow, right?
They love humanity, but they don't like people.
Exactly. But then you have people, the Christian instinct, which is to say every human person, even if they don't think like you, even if they're missing teeth, even if they eat McDonald's like Trump, whoever they are, they all have human dignity, and you cannot like quarantine all evil into their identity. And that's not compatible with the reigning elitist worldview, which is no, you absolutely can, and you can eliminate those people if necessary. It's violence versus this nonviolence of the gospel. So
yeah,
I really appreciate your time, sir. And I want people to check out your Substack, chrisbray.substack.com. And you can find your writings there. Anything else you'd like to end with?
No, I really appreciate that.
You take care.
All right, good. Talk to you soon.